Thank you very much for coming today. Now that the sun is out, the temptation is not to, so it's all the more fun to see you. Last week, we took up two thinkers within the tradition of Platonism, Plotinus from the 3rd century, and also Origen from the same period. We saw two of them who were operating within the Neoplatonic project of repairing the difficulty of Plato, that Plato has an ideal world that he thinks of as being real, and the material world which he conceives of as being an illusion, but he does not have a theory for why the ideal should have any impetus towards the material in the first place. We saw that Plotinus resolves this by using the idea of a world soul, and we discussed some of the benefits and difficulties of that conception. And we also saw that Origen went about this entire project in a different way by conceiving of each human being as being a body which was not only material, but was already also spiritual. So that our ability to conceive of the divine in the first place shows that we are using the only instrument of cognition possible, namely a body, which is also spiritual. Now, those are both idioms of discourse within Neoplatonism, and today we make a shift to a different approach to philosophy altogether, known as Stoicism. Now, I almost deliberately, during a little discussion previous to this presentation, talked about people reacting stoically when it rained. We always use a small s talking about such Stoicism, and it really is a deceptive way of using that term, because Stoicism is really not something invented by the stiff upper lip of British colonialism. Stoic sources were used during the period of the colonies, because that was also the period where schoolboys literally read in Latin authors such as Cicero, whom we will discuss today. And the moral of the story of reading Cicero was supposed to be, behave like a good grown-up Briton, don't show emotion, and act according only to rationality, and be polite. Now, only one part of that is correct. The one part of that that's a correct reading of Stoicism is that one should behave rationally. And it is the conception of rationality itself which is at the center of Stoicism in the ancient period, certainly with Cicero and before, as we'll see in just a moment, and then being embraced within Christianity, above all, by Augustine. One of the things that makes this a philosophy which is different from Platonism is that it is designed to be, from the very beginning, pragmatic. Cicero himself believed that the most important aspect of his career was not as a philosopher, but rather as a politician, a man of state. The political career did not come to a happy end. I explained this in some detail to my students earlier today, so if you want to know all the grisly facts about Cicero's assassination, please do consult with them. They're in a very good position to hand it on to you. But because in the end he truly failed as a politician, we know him as a philosopher. But the political vocation, and it was for him not just an ambition, it was a vocation, the political vocation always gave him a pragmatic interest and probably tended Cicero, over the course of time, to move away from the Platonism, which had been his starting point, which we now are familiar with, and to see the world in different terms, to see the world itself as rational. What a thought! That the world in which we live is not a matter of illusion or chaos or dumb material, but that the world is constructed in such a way that we may learn from it rationally. And for that reason, he thinks that you can analyze the nature of any agency within our entire human environment. That includes what he calls the nature of the gods. Now, to give you some sense of how his political and his philosophical career are tied together, he actually writes on the nature of the gods after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and he writes it as if it were a discussion with Brutus, the principal assassin of Julius Caesar, who was also a philosopher-politician or politician-philosopher. Imagine, in those days, you didn't have to sell real estate. For this reason, Cicero is concerned with developing those virtues which are going to permit Roman society to prosper. And he believes it needs to prosper as a republic. This was his failure. His partisanship of the republic obviously failed at the end of the day. And Rome became an empire despite his best efforts. But he handed on to the empire this conception of a supreme rationality of all nature, a rationality in which human society itself could also partake. He doesn't see nature as different from society. This is a typically Western romantic conception from the 18th century. He sees society and nature as embedded in the same rationality. And that means that every aspect of our human endeavor should work in accord with that rationality of nature, including how it is we conceive of the gods, because writing as he does just before the year of his death in 43, before the Common Era, he thinks in terms of polytheism, that there are many, many gods. Rome is founded on the gods such as peace and felicity and victory and Jupiter, all of them. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of these gods? Why? Because he says, piety, in the first quotation you see on page 1, like all the other virtues, cannot live on specious pretense. That is, we can't believe in the gods just because we know it's good for us to believe in the gods. Rather, if piety be destroyed, then sanctity and religion will of necessity disappear. So we have to ask the question, how do we get beyond what is specious pretense and ostentation, the simple outward veneration of the gods, to their actual substance in such a way that piety will be able to thrive? It's interesting that Cicero opens this dialogue with the question of piety, because just that question is posed in an earlier Socratic dialogue, the Euthyphro, in which Socrates developed his own nature of piety. Now Cicero is going to do the same thing, but in different terms. And he does this by citing, through one of his characters, Balbus, I love his character names, they're really rather nice, cites Zeno of Citium, who is actually the founder of the Stoic school. They're called the Stoics because Zeno was unlike Plato. He didn't like to work in the symposium indoors. Zeno worked outdoors. It was physically a public philosophy from the beginning, and he worked in the porticos, the porches of Athens, which were called stoa. So this came to be known as Stoic philosophy. It was named after where it was done. But that public place was always an important dimension of its purpose. And two central citations which turn out, I think, to be the very pivot of this work of Cicero's concern Zeno's understanding of the way in which you will find rationality in nature, that you should not conceive of nature as being alien from that ideal of rationality. And so he says, that which possesses the capacity to reason is more excellent than that which does not possess the capacity to reason. But nothing is more excellent than the universe. Therefore, the universe possesses the rational faculty. Now this you might well see as almost anticipating what Plotinus was about to do. You could move from this, if you wanted to the idea of a world soul. But this is not the move that Zeno or Cicero make, because Cicero goes on to make a second citation from Zeno. Nothing which is devoid of mind and destitute of reason can produce out of itself an animate and rational creature. It's an argument from production. Notice it's also an argument from design. The creationists did not make this up. It's a Stoic conception. You don't get the rational out of the irrational. But the universe does produce animate and rational creatures. Therefore, the universe possesses mind and reason. So Cicero identifies the way in which people can learn from nature. They can act better by learning from nature. Not that they imitate any one thing in nature. We will not do well as a society if we all imitate wolves or turtles or bears. But learning from them and understand the underlying rationality of the pattern, we can create an ideally natural society. Ironically, Cicero's Stoicism was embraced by the very empire that he opposed. So that in the end, the claim was made, what is more logical than having a single emperor at the center of a rational empire? And in fact, that emperor guiding the empire in the way that rationality guides nature should be seen as divine. And we should offer the emperor divine honors. Stoicism became an official governmental philosophy of the emperors, and one of its later contributors, Marcus Aurelius, 2nd century of the Common Era, was himself a Stoic, and he well should have been a Stoic. You had a complete integration of philosophy, religion, and power working along Stoic lines. And so Cicero comes to a conclusion, this is at the top of page 2, inasmuch as we have an innate and well-defined prevision of deity. By prevision, what he means is anticipation, one's anticipation of what deity is. Firstly, an animate being, and secondly, as a supremely and universally transcendent being, I can imagine nothing which is more perfect harmony with our prevision or preconception than first, the doctrine of the universe itself, which is indubitably the most exalted and glorious of created things, is animate and divine. And when he refers to this doctrine of the universe itself, what he means is that we ourselves as mind can learn from nature because nature can teach. There is something within nature that can be conveyed to mind. It is different from Plato's understanding of perception. In Plato's understanding, in any form, you do not perceive material reality when you perceive something real. When you perceive something real in Plato, your perception is of the ideal, which happens to correspond to the real. This is a different understanding of how this cognition takes place. Instead of cognition always being at the level of the ideal, you are able to use your reason to learn from nature. But that means nature has the capacity to teach you. Now I know why the ideal can teach me. The ideal can teach me because, well, it's ideal. We start with the idea of its perfection. But why should nature, which obviously has within it much cruelty and pain, as well as magnificent beauty, be able to teach? Because Cicero argues with Zeno, this is not an original part of his argument, with Zeno, Cicero argues there is an underlying, what he calls logos from Greek, what we might call logic or a principle. And that underlying logos is exactly what makes us teachable from nature. Our mind can perceive that logos. And this becomes a central contention of the Stoic philosophy, and the mark of difference between a Platonist and a Stoic philosophy is precisely this move to making logos central. Once that happened, it was possible for writers such as someone I mentioned last week, Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher, to argue that the universe itself, as created by God, was created when God spoke. What did God speak? If God spoke something, what was that? It had to be the Word. Had to be the Word. Philo says, when we say logos, word, we don't mean syllables. We don't mean God spoke the word like he began reciting Genesis. God spoke the word because that is the underlying rationality of the universe. And so Philo of Alexandria began a transformation of Stoicism in the direction of monotheism by arguing that if the word is there in nature, that word must proceed from some single source, because only a single source can provide you with logic. Logic proceeds from a mind, not from discussion, not from the controversies among the gods. And this is an argument which we'll see Augustine, much later, will pick up from Philo, who taught during the 1st century. In the 1st century as well, there was a certain writer who clearly learned from Philo and Philo's adjustment of Stoicism. Who said, in the beginning was the Logos? The Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. So you have this notion in the Gospel according to John, which represents a popularization of Stoicism in its time, because it's a much simpler document than Cicero or Augustine for that matter, but you see that it's using a reflection on that same notion of the divine rationality in nature itself. And then John's Gospel also makes a second step. The first step comes from Philo. The second step within Philo is an anticipation insofar as Philo also says that there's a reflection of this logos in human beings. That's what permits them to have mind. But in John's Gospel, the step is also taken of maintaining that we would not fully understand that we had logos unless logos at some stage actually becomes flesh. If logos doesn't become flesh in the way that we are flesh, how would we ever have conceived of logos in the first place? And that logos becomes flesh when? At the birth of Christ, exactly. So that this, remember I was saying last time that Origen's Christ is eternal from the perspective of Platonism. The Christ of John's Gospel is also eternal from the perspective of Stoicism. And it is this Stoic stream then, which is picked up by St. Augustine centuries later in his City of God. And interestingly, he also picks it up in circumstances comparable to what Cicero is facing. He is offering it as a pragmatic philosophy because the issue is literally who should rule, who should have the power of government. And the reason this comes as a pressing question for Augustine is that in 410, Rome had been sacked by Alaric. And so the question emerged, has this occurred because Christianity has been acknowledged by then as the official religion of the Roman Empire? What answer do we have for those who claim that Christianity has actually produced the disaster instead of being an answer to disaster? In the City of God, Augustine argues that our human experience is always mixed. We have opportunities by means of our access to the Logos to be able to rule ourselves correctly, but because of our corrupt condition, we are also in a situation in which self-love can at any moment turn us away from the love of God. And the result is disaster, whatever our belief system might be. The result of that is that sometimes in the past, prior to the recognition of Christianity, the Roman Empire did prosper, but more often than not, it ran into self-contradiction and difficulty. And he argues that the empire's turn to Christ does not produce instant perfection, because we are in a position now where after the Word became flesh, borrowing from John, it is possible for us as human beings to turn from the love of self to the love of God, which is our rationality, but that doesn't mean that we will do that. That is still a matter of human choice. So within this setting, he makes out his case, which includes, as we'll see when we come to the last quotation, a direct reflection of Cicero. That is, Augustine is absorbing Cicero in order, he thinks, to improve the entire Stoic approach. So he makes out his case. This is all from Book 4 in relation to this question of who should rule, in the sense of who should really have government. Therefore, if the true God is worshipped and is served with authentic rights and good morals, it is beneficial that good persons should rule far and wide and for a long time. And this is beneficial not so much for the good persons themselves as those over whom they rule. For, as far as they themselves are concerned, their piety and integrity, which are great gifts from God, are enough to bring them true happiness by which this life is lived and well, and therefore eternal life is attained. This is a purely Stoic understanding, that the fact of piety, of integrity, is its own reward. And he presses this in the service of his newly Christianized Stoicism, but it remains without question a form of Stoicism, and what comes with it is the notion that the ruler himself, he always thinks of it as a him. I have to apologize for Augustine, but there you are, he was a Roman, and they thought that way. Because the emperor himself is served only by his own piety and integrity. He, as far as the practicality of rule is concerned, should only be acting on the basis of what is good for his subjects. Not Augustine, but an earlier church father, looking at this idea of a Christianized empire, his name was Eusebius, made the comparison between the emperor ruling in the empire and Christ ruling over the earth, with the one being a representative of the other. You see how this is similar to the older imperial idea that the emperor himself is a kind of God. Instead of making the emperor God, you make him a reflection of Christ. It's an example of the mutation of Stoicism within the new environment of a Christian empire. Then Augustine also has to pick up why he's thinking of the matter this way, of monotheism, and particularly monotheism in its Christian form, which, it must be said, was the only monotheism going for the empire at large. The empire at large was well aware of Judaism, but was not about to convert to Judaism. At this stage, probably about 4% of the population of the empire was Jewish, but you had an ethnic understanding of Judaism which made assimilation within Roman politics virtually impossible. So if there was to be a monotheism that also involved some affirmation of the physical and political universe, it was going to be Christianity. Augustine then presses this advantage in arguing against a multiplicity of gods and goddesses. And so he writes in the second excerpt, "It was not truth but folly that made these goddesses. For these virtues, the virtues of felicity, the goddess happiness, and the goddess peace, he said, these are not goddesses. These are virtues. These are things that people do. These virtues are gifts of the true God, not goddesses themselves. Still, where there is virtue and felicity, why look for anything else? That is, if you have them, exercise them. Don't build a statue to them. What would satisfy a person for whom virtue and felicity are not enough? Virtue includes everything we should do, and felicity everything we should desire. So he argues that a properly Stoic approach basically would demythologize pantheism, to understand that these deities are virtues which should be put into effect. Victory, justice, felicity, peace, whatever it is, we should do those. If we worship them, we deflect ourselves from the moral task, and should understand that our understanding of the moral task comes from the single logic, the logos, of a single God. This, for Augustine, is what properly makes us human. That is, the capacity that we have by means of our minds to understand the logos which surrounds us. And here, as you see in the third excerpt, he actually quotes Cicero, as he does many times during this same dialogue. Cicero says, Homer invented these things, that is, the attributes of the gods. Homer invented these things and transferred human qualities to the gods. I would rather, Cicero himself says, I would rather he had transferred divine qualities to us. Well, Augustine couldn't resist that opening. And so he says, a serious-minded man. Cicero had good reason to be displeased with a poet who made up stories of divine crime. That is, it is not only the illusion that pantheism encourages, it is also the moral decay that it portrays that shows the logic of the universe cannot be reflected in pantheism. It must rather be within an understanding that the guiding principle of the physical and natural universe is transcendent and rational. And that, and this is the point that Augustine is also making here, and that this logos which lies within the universe also lies within each individual human person. Because we could not perceive logos without logos within us. One of his axiomatic statements, one of Augustine's axiomatic statements is, cor ad cor loquitur, like speaks to like. You only understand by means of empathy. Whether you're dealing with another human being or with God, it is that empathic reaction that brings about understanding. That means that the logos in the universe is also instantiated in each individual human being. This is the second major move that Augustine makes, in addition to his argument for monotheism, which he picks up from Philo of Alexandria, and he picks up from the Gospel according to John. He adds another argument, which is reflected in his axiom of cor ad cor loquitur, which is that the logos of the universe must also be, that divine principle must also be within each individual. That is a great refinement of what's in the Gospel according to John. Gospel according to John is saying, in a kind of primitive effort in the same direction, the Word became flesh. Augustine is providing an argument for that by saying, our very capacity to be able to perceive the logos in nature means we have the logos within us. And this, in turn, causes him to argue, along with other patristic teachers, that we should conceive of this logos as being timeless. Yes, it obviously was present with us physically in the case of Jesus, but it's also present with us now, after Jesus, and the logos was present with us from the very beginning, because the Word was in the beginning. In eternity, there is no before or after. You can't just be eternal moving forward. If you are eternal moving forward, you're also eternal moving backward. And so, just as for Augustine, as for Origen, Jesus is important first of all as Christ, and not as what we would call historical. So for Augustine, as for Origen, Christ also is to be understood as eternal, primordial as well as eternal into the future. I call attention to that because the great creeds of Christianity, which come out at the same time these Christian philosophers are working, bring together where they agree, but also deliberately do not say certain things. They do not stamp themselves as having to be Platonist or as having to be Stoic, because both Platonists and Stoics were operating within the church at exactly that same time. They had to find a way in which they could express their faith, which included their own philosophies, but did not exclude others, which no one could at that time disprove. For all of its violence, an interestingly tolerant age. Thanks very much for coming today. As Fred rightly said at the beginning, I tried to keep it to a half hour. Didn't quite work it today. But it was Cicero and Augustine. And he said they're complicated guys. Yes, please, Tess.
Last week we were talking about Origen's perception of the consciousness being Christ,
Mm-hmm.
basic, universal consciousness. How does that differ from Zeno's statement here that the universe is animate and divine? Does it have the same idea, or is it just not going so far as to say that it is Christ?
Yes, Zeno, because of when he's writing, is in no position personally to know anything of Christ, because he's a Socratic period philosopher. He has a conception, however, of the rationality of the universe. So, from the perspective of thinkers such as Augustine, and someone else who agreed with him, namely St. Jerome, the same person who translated the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, Cicero could be called literally our Cicero. What do they mean? That Cicero so anticipated us, he was in touch with the Logos, but that Logos was Christ, only he didn't know that. And in the same way, statements such as Zeno makes, and also I have to say statements such as Socrates sometimes makes. I mean, Socrates says, whenever I'm about to do something, there's a principle of divine restraint. He says a daimonion, a voice that tells me not to do something. And so the argument was, indeed, here you have the operation of the Logos, and the argument is they did not and could not identify that Logos personally because Jesus had not been born yet. They still know of a Logos which we know of as Messiah, because we don't even know the concept of Messiah in the Greco-Roman world until it comes to us from Judaism and Christianity. So the position would be they were in contact with that which they could not name. And so the point of the incarnation, the point of the Word becoming flesh, is that it is then possible to name the Logos in human terms, which it had not been possible before. That's the underlying logic of John and Augustine, with other thinkers being seen as truly exceptional reflections, prophetic-like anticipations of the Logos, only not in the scriptures of Israel, in the philosophy of Greece and Rome. And in fact, many fathers of the church refer to these previous Greco-Roman thinkers in prophetic terms, and for those reasons. Yes, please. This is an excellent question, whether Paul is in anticipation of what we can all also see in Augustine, but in a fuller form. And the answer is certainly yes, because of his biography. Paul was brought up in Tarsus, and Tarsus was a well-known philosophical city where people used to love to come and debate and run open-air seminars. And many of those who did so were professional Stoic philosophers who would actually be paid by the city to put on their courses. And the reason for this was, again, this will show you how important Stoicism became. When the tutor of Augustus decided that Augustus was grown up now, and he, Athenodorus, was getting kind of tired, he asked if he could be given some sinecure somewhere. And Augustus said, yes, why don't you become mayor of Tarsus? And so you had a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, running a city. So the result of that is, for example, the Stoics had a view of the way in which a well-governed society should run, and of how this well-governed society would be comparable to the governance of the universe. And so they said, just as the empire is one body with a single soul, the emperor, so is the universe one body with a single soul, the Logos. This shows up in Paul as the idea of the body of Christ. What he is doing is absorbing his Stoicism, just as Paul absorbed his Judaism. Both are clearly represented within his thought. So that these elements of Stoicism are very plain in what St. Paul says, and they also help us in particular to understand Paul's attitude towards the Roman Empire itself and towards the law, which he sees both in terms of the Torah and in terms of the customary law of the empire. The difference between Paul and Augustine is that within Paul these are all elements intellectually brought in to his overall theology, but Paul does not present himself as a Stoic philosopher, and he does not enter into a conversation with other Stoic philosophers of his time. Augustine clearly does that. Paul might have done it. He lived during the time of prominent Stoics during the first century, but he decided not to do that. Much like the Gospel according to John, what we can see is at that stage, at the stage of the New Testament, some of these philosophical ideas are being reflected, they are being explored, they're clearly believed. I mean, the concept of the body of Christ is, shall we say, somewhat important in theology to this day. It is a borrowing from Stoicism, quite clearly, beautifully metabolized in Paul's thought. Yet, Paul doesn't say you need to be a Stoic to be a Christian, nor does he say the best form of Christian theology is of a Stoic idiom. Augustine is essentially saying that. Augustine is taking a much more clear position. He is operating as a philosopher because for every statement that he makes, Augustine poses the basic questions and works through them. Paul and the Gospel according to John do not function in that fashion. And this is a good question both because of the way it can show us how ideas can influence a religion before it becomes philosophical, and also of import because it permits us to understand that the philosophy that is deployed within Christianity is not necessary. That is, there is no requirement that you do philosophy. There is no requirement that you have a certain philosophy. But Christian theology is nonetheless involved with this kind of philosophical analysis, and is therefore influenced by it. It's an illustration of the way in which philosophy and religion are necessarily related because they are speaking in universal terms, but they are also different because within a philosophical discussion, you are concerned with the single question of meaning and how meaning works in the world and in you. Within a religious system, you do have the question of meaning, and some people within religious systems spend a great deal of time with that. But they don't have to. I went several years ago, I was visiting in a different state, and there was an election going on for bishop. And they asked me to come to the meeting. I think the idea was I was supposed to be a candidate. And each of the people already candidates stood up and literally said these words, "I am not a theologian." And they meant that as a recommendation of themselves. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, I understood they mean by that I really shouldn't be a candidate in this diocese. But what they mean by that is, actually, religion is about other things. Religion is about ethics, social action. Religion is about ritual. Well, it is about those things. That's what makes it something of a juggling game, huh? Because those three things are about equally weighted. And if you change any of them, if you change the ritual, if you change the ethics, and you change the meaning, and they might change at any time, the religious system will shift. It's a fascinating development. It is true, on the other hand, that philosophers have this tendency, shall we say, to disagree with one another. You know, like we've seen the Plato, Stoics. I mean, this is hard. And you have people trying to mix and match. I mean, Cicero does try to mix and match. And in fact, he's difficult to read for this reason. You have to read him as he progresses through his dialogue. And then he finally reveals at the end, yeah, this Stoic business is really good. But he won't say that until he's run all the way through an Epicurean point of view and all the way through a later Platonic point of view. So yeah, there's volatility in the study of philosophy too, but within the field of meaning. And that's what really makes it useful for people trying to understand religion, because it gives you a kind of base point of how in that time people are thinking philosophically. And that permits you to understand what happens when people from this particular religion begin to do that, and what it shows you about them, and what it shows you about the philosophy that they're attempting to appropriate. And the Cardinal of Red Hook has given me his sign, which means I'll see you next week, I hope.